Well, let me just share what Jesus said. Let's go to Matthew 6, verses 1 through 4. Jesus assumed three things about us. This is how we kind of unload the overload in our life. What we start doing is focusing on what Jesus assumed we'd be doing. Now, if you've ever been in any sport or any art, and you had a master training you, like a master coach or a master of any art, you know, in music or in anything, gymnastics, if you really admired your coach, what they even assumed about you became a command. You know, your wish is my command. If you loved them and they said to you, now I know you're probably running 4 miles every morning before school, you'd go, oh yeah, I'll run 4 miles before school every morning. Look at what Jesus said are his assumptions. Jesus assumed his disciples would give, pray, and fast. In Matthew 6, Jesus expresses some expectations or desires of his disciples. Now note, these are not commands. Jesus doesn't say, I command you to do this. He could. He's God. He doesn't. Notice what he says, and just follow along with your eyes. Verse 1. Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men, to be seen by them. Otherwise, you don't have any reward from your Father in heaven. Verse 2. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, he doesn't command us. He's assuming we're going to be doing charitable deeds. Keep going to verse 3. When you do a charitable deed, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. Now, keep on going down to verse 5. And when you pray. Do you see that? The form of this is, it's an assumption. You and I are going to be praying. Look at verse 6. But when you pray, keep going to verse 7. And when you pray, and verse 9, in this manner, therefore, pray. Do you understand? Jesus is saying in verse 1, in verse 2, in verse 3, when you do that, this charitable deed, and then he says, you know, in verses 5 through 9, when you pray, when you pray, when you pray. Now look at verse 16. Interesting. Jesus assumes not only would they be praying or giving and praying, they would be fasting. He says in verse 16, moreover, when you fast, he doesn't say to fast. He said when you fast. Like, you're going to. And we already looked at Mark 2. He said especially us in the church age are going to be, because we're longing for him. Look at verse 17. And when you fast. So think about that. With me, just ponder these verses. In Matthew 6, Jesus expresses his expectations or desires of his disciples. He doesn't command us to do these things. See, that's the neat thing about our walk with Christ. I don't get up every morning and think, oh, I know I have to do this. I get up and say, I want to keep his expectations, his commands, because I love him. He assumes I'll be doing these things. Because I love him, I want to do it. That's John 14:21. He that has my commandments, my expectations, my desires, and keeps them, he it is that loves me. We're motivated by love. Jesus never commanded these disciplines or choices. Notice that. He just states them as assumptions that these are things they would be doing. In other words, Jesus said, this is what I expect you're already doing as my disciples. Now, what are these things? What are these assumptions of giving, praying, and fasting? These are the normal overflows of a chapter 5, verse 6, hunger and thirst after righteousness. If you hunger and thirst after God, then that God assumes that those who hunger and thirst after him are giving, praying, fasting. Interesting. Let's talk about giving the poor. Look at verses 1 through 4. Jesus assumed that his disciples would be giving to the needy. It was his expectation that any disciple of his would be concerned and engaged in giving to the poor and needy. Think about the implications of that in our society. We are a very successful society, and there is usually a comfortable distance between us and these kind of people. Think about that. Now, I didn't know that when I was growing up. The same dad that was Paul's counselor worked at the rescue mission, in Lansing City Rescue Mission on Michigan Avenue downtown. That, I think it's Michigan, goes right up to the Capitol. And right there, in the seedy, red light, bad, I'm talking about 50 years ago, the Lansing City Rescue Mission was right there. My parents hauled us down there, if not monthly, weekly. They said, we never want to get far, because my parents were alcoholics. And they said, we never want to get far from what God saved us from, and we want you to see the effects of sin. We want you to see what happens to people who give themselves over to the lusts of their flesh and desires. And so I grew up standing in the line, with the spoon, putting stuff, just like over here at the dining hall, only at the rescue mission. And I grew up with my mother taking home the laundry from that place. And you know what's worse than the laundry? They would bring home the people. When someone got saved there and wanted to have a fresh start, the rescue mission used to farm them out into Christian families so they could see a family. Did you know my bed? I had a trundle bed. You know what a trundle bed is? It's a wall of drawers, and the bottom one pulls out so far, and then the next one pulls out so far, and then the top one doesn't pull out. And that's where my oldest sister, my middle sister, and then me. We were in our trundle. We were in a little tiny trundle bed setup. One room. I was the bottom. Whenever we had a missionary, out of your trundle bed, the missionary slept on that. You sleep on the floor. I grew up sleeping next to snoring missionaries in my bed. And it was such a small house, there was one bathroom, and the washing machine and dryer were on the wall right at the head of my bed. So when my mom would roar up the washer and dryer, it would be thumping, and the thing would be going, and the guy would be snoring in my bed, and I'd be laying on the floor. And you know what I thought? What an honor to have that person that spoke in our church sleep in my bed. Do you understand how you can shape the rest of your children's lives? Now, do any of you have 3 children? Don't raise your hand. 3 children in one room? If you only had 2 bedrooms in your house, would you invite people to stay overnight? If you have 2 bedrooms and you have 3 kids in one and you and your husband or wife in the other one, would you invite people to stay there? Would you even think of having a person sleep on the trundle bed while 2 others are right above them?